just sort of smarter.
Yeah, smarter, less bleary-eyed, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, you can sort of smell the kind of wealth and.
Is there like a link? Should we tweet about this or someone?
Yes.
Have
Oh
they tweeted about
God,
it?
yeah.
Should
Yes,
tweet and
we
say we're
must.
doing it?
Tweet now.
Tweet now or forever hold your peace.
Oh God, I don't think I've got my thing, but.
I didn't even tell my mum to watch.
I just WhatsApped mine. I didn't actually know she would be able to. So.
Ben, I'm just going to retweet you.
Excellent. I do what I'm told.
You already tweeted it.
I was told.
Have you tweeted? Oh, I'm going to retweet
Company
you then.
man.
What's your Twitter handle?
Company man.
Jesus. What will this year's election mean for Britain? What do the parties have in mind for your children's education, for instance? How will their policies affect the value of your home? The pound in your pocket? Or the environment you live in? At The Times, Sunday Times and Times Radio, we know that what happens in Westminster has a real impact on your world. So whatever politicians say or do, we'll explain what that means for you.
Welcome to the Times and the Sunday Times newsroom. We're here live with From Westminster to Your World. I'm Manveen Rana. I'm the host of The Story, the daily news podcast from the Times. You might know us as Stories of Our Times, but in a rebrand that some are saying was as significant as the moment Labour became New Labour and the Tories ditched the torch in favour of a tree, we've renamed ourselves The Story, so do have a look wherever you get your podcasts. Advert over. I'm delighted to say we're joined by an amazing panel tonight. We've got the cream of the newsroom here to dissect the news of the week. We've got Josh Glancy, who is the editor of the Sunday Times News Review, and I think it would be fair to say over the last few months a bit of a Keir Starmer stalker, so he's very much our man on the ground in this historic election campaign. We also have Aisha Hazarika, who's a former political advisor, a former stand-up comic, a current Labour peer and a brilliant presenter here at Times Radio. We have Ben Spencer, science editor at the Sunday Times and climate specialist for all of us. And Matthew Saeed, whose list of accomplishments is very long, but does manage to include both table tennis champion, author, broadcaster and columnist, thought-provoking columnist here at the Sunday Times.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the ping pong. It's not an introduction without that. I was
There's
hoping
not
to
an
see a
introduction.
table
I should
here.
have called it Whiff Waff, really. This is a political debate.
Although there was a bit of irony when you described us as the cream of the newsroom. Did you spot that? Tiny
entirely
element.
sincere.
Entirely sincere. I'm sticking with it.
I'm glad you didn't do inverted,
The cream.
They're the only ones we could get at short notice.
I like it.
We will be running these events every week in the run-up to the election, so do send in questions whenever you have them. Thanks to everyone who already has. And if you'd like to send in any more over the next hour, then just use the Q&A bit on the screen. But before we do, we have a bit of breaking news this evening. Aisha, a new poll has dropped.
We do. In fact, we don't have just one poll today. We've got 3 of these MRP polls, which is like a slightly different way of doing polling. And I think one of the things about this election campaign is that it's not been the most exciting election campaign because the polling has been so strong. So today there are 3 astonishing MRP polls. Savanta puts Tories on 53 seats, Labour on a whopping 516, Liberal Democrats on 30. There's another interesting fact in this. Rishi Sunak projected to lose his seat. He would be the first sitting Prime Minister to lose his seat in a general election campaign. There's a YouGov one that puts Tories on 108 seats, Labour on 425, Lib Dems on 67, and another one, more in comment, saying that Labour is set to win an 162 seat majority.
Big range, isn't it?
There is a big range there. I mean, how much should we be trusting the polls in this? We are getting a big majority story coming out of all of them, but they're obviously to different degrees. Ben, you're the expert on all this.
Well, I mean, the general picture is probably right. The number of seats, I mean, I think we've still got a couple of weeks to go of the election campaign. People change their mind. People lie when they get phoned up for these things.
Yeah.
And when you're actually looking at individual seats, these things are, I mean, they're big numbers, MRP polls. They're kind of 40,000, depending on which poll you're talking about. But when you're still talking about 40,000 out of a whole population, the whole population of what, 30, 40 million? And when you're talking about the electorate, that gets give or take. But when you're talking about individual constituencies, it's very difficult.
Yeah.
So the
I
chance
have-
of
I
Rishi
have-
Sunak actually losing his seat, unless that polling's done in Richmond, I think. We'll wait and see.
So-
And just to follow that, I mean, I've just come back from Scotland, and there was an MRP poll which to me just didn't feel right, because it projected Labour not winning that many seats, and when you're on the ground you get a very different granular feel when you're actually canvassing in specific areas.
I have never been asked a question in an opinion poll. Have you?
No.
So who are these people?
I know.
These 40,000? This is a curious business.
I think it's the same 40,000.
Every time. The other thing that I'd perhaps draw your attention to is that when you look at incumbent leaders across the Western world, they are also suffering very serious deficits in polling. It's not just Rishi Sunak, who I think's net approval rating is something like minus 50 something, which is almost unprecedented. Biden is deeply unpopular in the United States, despite the economy growing at over 2%, which is very high relative to the rest of the Western world. The same is true of Scholz in Germany. Macron is deeply unpopular in France and may suffer in parliamentary elections. I think if we focus too narrowly on the UK, we miss the deep structural trend here, which is deep incumbency disadvantage across the Western world. And I think this says something about other things that are tremendously interesting. The rise of the populist right, fears over immigration, declining trust in politics more generally. And I think all of this takes some real deconstructing. I do worry to an extent that we get overly fixated on what's happening in this country and miss the geopolitical picture, which I think is quite troubling for the strength and vitality of Western liberal democracies.
It does also make the point that although a Labour majority could be enormous, it could be a huge landslide, it might be quite shallow. You know, if people are voting out of dissatisfaction, lack of trust, etc., it's not necessarily out of a binding long-term love or affection that they're voting. So you could win a landslide, but it could prove to be quite shallow.
Well, on that, it's really interesting that this week we've had the Tories basically accepting a colossal defeat and using the idea of a landslide almost as a campaigning tool. Aisha, how effective is that? What's the thinking there?
I'm absolutely baffled by this, because even in the dark days, like when I was a Labour advisor and I was working for the sort of last few years of the Labour government, we knew we were going to lose that election. When we were kind of in the sort of 2009, 2010, once we got to 2010, we knew in our bones that we were going to lose that. Yeah, definitely. You totally know. That's why we wanted to make sure we tidied up key bits of legislation. Like I was working on this thing called the Equality Act, and we were absolutely, it was like a race against time to get it on the statute, because we knew this was going to be an important part of our legacy. However, even though we knew that in our bones, and we said goodbye to all our civil servants, and we knew we were never going to see them again in this capacity, when you were on the election campaign, even when disastrous things happened like the Mrs. Duffy incident, every single person knew that when they had a camera in front of them, they had to say, we're going to win. We are going to win. They've got no chance. We're going to win. That midway through a general election campaign, to suddenly not only say you don't think you're going to win, but you're saying that your opponents are going to get a supermajority. It is crackers. And also, let's not forget that we just had the local elections a couple of weeks ago in May, not that long ago. And the line from the Conservatives at that point was because of one poll that Thrasher and Rawlings did, saying actually Labour's on course for a hung parliament, so it's going to be another chaos, coalition. So you've gone from chaos, coalition, hung parliament to midway through a campaign suddenly going, actually they're going to get a supermajority. It is all over the place. I've never seen anything like it.
Things did look a lot closer and ended up being a lot closer probably in 2010, whereas clearly they're looking at the same polls we are. There has been some indication that the supermajority line that they're putting out there is resonating with voters, and the idea that you're going to get a kind of Labour government that has no accountability in the Commons. So I do think as a last-ditch tactic, it might have some resonance.
Well, yes, it's a question of political tactics. Is it going to lead to a few more people voting for Conservatives out of a fear of a Labour supermajority? But it's not going to change fundamentally that Labour is almost certain to win. I take it we all agree about that, and they're going to have a pretty sizable majority. So I think the two big questions really: one, how will Labour govern? You probably have more insight into this than the rest of us. I'm a former Labour Party candidate. Did you know that?
No.
2001 general election. There's a
we
gasp of
over
shock
that now,
in the newsroom here. It's only about 3 people. No, but
What was your constituency?
Yeah, what was your...
I stood. Well, you'll laugh. But here's a test of the knowledge of the panel here. I stood in Wokingham. Who did I stand? Who was the Conservative incumbent?
John Redwood.
See, this is why she's a baroness. This is the knowledge that they've got. So I stood, because it's where I grew up, in East Reading, a suburb called Early, and I was tremendously interested in politics in my late 20s, early 30s. But what I was going to say is, I think the really interesting question, and I'm not completely inspired by Starmer's manifesto, but I'm conscious that everything that Labour frontline politicians are saying at the moment is not to do with what they will actually do after the election. It's to try and ensure they win the election. And it's a Potemkin exercise. And I'm finding this quite frustrating. It's true of all elections, but I think particularly of this one, because Labour has lost so consistently, and there is a deep paranoia that something horrible will go wrong. Like it did for Kinnock, of course, in 1992 against John Major, when he lost narrowly and was expected to win by some of the polling and the build-up. But the other fundamental, I think this is a tremendously interesting question for Britain, is what will happen to the Conservative Party after the general election.
Yeah.
Farage is outflanking them to an extent. I did see a poll today that he's going to have a very big victory in Clacton. And this is very important for our democratic politics, and I think it's an open question.
Well, I do want us to talk about Farage and reform in just a moment. Before we do, it's really interesting that you sort of say that we're not really being presented with the sort of policies we expect they'll govern with. A lot of people in this election, as you were saying, are voting against something rather than for something. So if Labour ends up with a massive majority, can they take that as a massive mandate, or should they should they understand that actually people have voted them into power because they hated the alternative? I mean, how does that work when you're trying to work out how to govern?
I think that's a really good question, and I think definitely what is true on the doorstep, and I've just been out canvassing in all different parts of Scotland, Dundee, East Renfrewshire, Coatbridge and Lanarkshire, where I'm from, and I've heard the same feedback from candidates all across the country. People definitely want a change. They definitely do not want to vote for the Conservatives. Many people in Scotland, by the way, are also quite fed up with the SNP, who have been in power for 17 years in Scotland. People forget about that as well. But they're almost saying, I will vote for Labour, but it's almost a process of elimination. There is not a kind of fizz and crackle of excitement about the Labour Party, but there is a real sense of disillusionment and despair about all politics at the moment, the lack of trust that people have. And a lot of people were saying to me and others, look, I will vote for Labour. Keir Starmer seems, they're not scared of Keir Starmer in the same way they were of someone like Jeremy Corbyn. Yeah. But they're also saying, to your point, I just don't know if anybody can make my life better. So I think Labour should be really alive to this. And if there is a big majority, but let's say on a much lower turnout, for example, and let's say quite a lot of those seats will be quite marginal Labour seats as well, and having a parliamentary party that big is also quite a difficult thing to manage. There can be a lot of internal opposition as well. I think Labour's going to be really seized of wanting to make sure that they can be seen to restore some kind of trust, which is a really difficult thing to do, and to restore some sense of competency. Now, this is all difficult enough to do when you have a growing economy and things are quite good. Labour's going to have to do this when they know their inheritance is going to be really, really tough. There's probably a number of big political crises that will hit quite early on as well. So I think, and quite an inexperienced team as well. So I think Labour, certainly people I've spoken to, are not kind of coming in with a, punch the air, we know it all, we're brilliant, we're just going to boss it. I think they're very aware of just how difficult and how tough it's going to be if they win.
I mean, Josh, we are looking at potentially a massive majority, but none of that kind of excitement you had with Blair coming in. There's not that sort of great surge of national support. You've been following Starmer around through the campaign. I mean, firstly, what sort of reception is he getting wherever he turns up, and what do you think's missing? Well, why isn't there that?
Well, I mean, people who were around in '97, I was quite young, but people who...
All right, Josh.
How old were you, Josh?
All right, Josh. No one likes to show off. No one likes to show off.
But people will tell you that it wasn't quite the national festival that it sometimes looked back upon as. And actually it was only when he won the landslide really that people start to really get excited about it. But putting that aside, I think what I found with Starmer is that there is a huge chasm really between private care and public care. Now that is true of any Prime Minister, any public figure. It was very true of Ed Miliband, people often said it, but it really is a yawning chasm. You get into a private conversation with Keir, or even if you listen to him on a podcast in a one-on-one conversation, he's genial, he's quite witty, he's convivial, he's quite relaxed and relaxing person to be around. He's not an intimidating person to talk to at all. But in private, he holds himself very tightly, and his staff is all very tightly wound. And he does seem a little bit wary of showing his full self, and I think there's a number of reasons for that. I think part of it's rooted in his childhood. He said that to me, that his parents weren't hugely emotive. His dad was very taciturn. His mother was very stoic. She was very ill a lot of the time. I think part of it is because he's been a barrister his whole life, and he's very methodical. He's very process driven. So he doesn't very cautious, but he doesn't want to give anything away. He doesn't want to say anything that he hasn't thought through in advance. And you might expect a barrister to be very good at argumentation, but as we saw in the debate, the kind of quick-fire, snappy, soundbitey stuff is not his forte. When I've seen him in court, it's a slow, methodical process towards an end point. And I also think that he thinks the performative aspects of politics are a gimmick. And that actually what the media asks of contemporary politicians is absurd, and that no one could be authentic or sincere in such an environment. And rather than be a Boris Johnson, his sort of antipode, and do the sort of performing seal act, he will be, grave and sincere and careful, and that's what a statesman should be. And if we don't like it, well, he's probably going to win a big majority anyway, so be it.
But he's sort of lucky that the circumstances mean he's going to get a massive majority. If he was standing in his own right in another election, he might not have, that wouldn't...
We at least need to know what antipode means. Where did that come? I mean, this is a very... Antithesis, is it the same as antithesis?
Well,
like Antipodean, it's like down under.
Opposite. Yeah, that's still
Sorry.
good. It was still good.
It was very, very... But can I just pick up when you said about luck? Because I think there is, I think Keir Starmer is a lucky general, because I've worked with some very unlucky generals, including Gordon Brown and Ed Miliband, who, got felled by a bacon sandwich. So, I've worked with some quite unlucky people. But
there's still time.
Luck is definitely part of it, and certainly Boris Johnson Partygate and Liz Truss and Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland has helped Keir Starmer. But I do think it is important to note that I think in politics, like in a lot of bits of life, luck is often years of preparation and getting yourself ready to meet that moment of opportunity, and if you can turn that to your advantage. And one of the things in politics is often, like when you're prepping someone for PMQs and your opponent has made a massive gaffe that week, sometimes open goals can actually be quite hard to convert into big wins for you. So I think he is lucky, but he has also been able to take the party and get it into shape so it's able to use those moments and make good on them.
May I say, it's fascinating, Josh, what you said about Keir Starmer, and a really interesting insight to his character away from the TV cameras. I'm glad he's a bit more convivial when he's in private.
You should
perhaps
have said that-
disagree
you
a
would say the
tiny
same
little.
thing,
Oh,
wouldn't you?
definitely. I'd absolutely
I'm not,
say the
yeah,
same
and I
thing.
don't.
Yeah.
I'm not. I mean, you're a Labour person, but I really have no reason
You're
to
more
say that.
neutral,
He
are you?
really
Yeah.
is quite chill company.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've met him once for about 10 seconds. I actually saw him in a service station with his minders a few months ago, and I
Did
don't know what I
you
could
follow
infer.
him too? Because that's what Josh does.
No, I didn't follow him. I actually shows what a good journalist I am. I walked past him, didn't want to disturb. I walked past Lord Frost on the way to the building here. Didn't say, well, I've got to get going with this journalistic inquisitiveness. But let me disagree a little bit with Aisha. I agree with you to a point. That Starmer has been lucky. He's lucky in the sense that he's in a very good position to win a general election after 14 years of very poor Conservative administration. So it's a good time to be leader of the opposition. He is not going to inherit a good position when he becomes Prime Minister. When Blair became Prime Minister, he inherited a fantastic fiscal position, a growing economy, and a very cheap oil price. Starmer will be, which is a fundamental ingredient of growth. Starmer will come in with the debt to GDP ratio of close to 100%. This is an historic high. The tax burden at the highest it's been for a very, very long time. The inflation-adjusted energy price extremely high. He has accepted the Conservative proposition that there should be billions, up to 18 billion of expenditure cuts for non-protected services at a time when productivity in the public services is low and public dissatisfaction high. Let me say, and you may disagree with this, the idea that he should be cautious and look for stability would be a catastrophic historic mistake. Britain is in decline relative to other nations. We have not grown our economy or the efficiency of our productivity for 14 years. We're going to become a second-rate power unless Labour, with its unless it wields the collateral of a big majority to do seriously bold things. I think there are things it could do to shift the trajectory of growth, to change trust in politics, to deal with immigration, legal and illegal. I see nothing at all, except potentially the energy policy, which is still very vague. I don't see plans to build a fleet of high-quality, new design nuclear reactors, which is what I think we need. No real fundamental change in our taxation structure. It's tinkering, and that is not going to do it. It's not going to. Do we really believe that Starmer's going to raise productivity when Moore's law has failed to do so? I don't think so.
They're not talking a very big game on tech, on innovation and AI.
Yeah.
That's not been a big theme of the campaign. It's a lot about public services, which is obviously important, but that's one area where I felt that I want to hear more from them. I don't think it's particularly in Starmer's wheelhouse, that stuff.
Ben, do you think they should be much more adventurous?
Well, I think I agree with what Matthew said, but also politically, they kind of, we all agree that they're probably going to win a pretty hefty majority, but they keep on telling us this is a 10-year project, a decade. They need another election to win. But we know so little, and I know this is a Tory attack line, but it also happens to be true. We know so little about what they're going to do because they're not telling us. That yes, they've got a manifesto, but it's quite vague, as you say, and actually very similar to what the Tory manifesto is on key areas. But people are crying out for change. And as you say, they've got an opportunity here, massive poll leadership. It's so cautious, it's almost painful. What's going to happen after the election is everyone's going to realise what's next and what are we getting, and it's more of the same. And they risk just losing this gift of a polling position and just wishing it away by not doing something with it.
And Ben, you look a lot at things like climate policy, for example, which does feel very urgent and should be really at the top of the agenda in a lot of these election debates. Very rarely comes up. Is that something everybody should be bolder on?
Well,
what have you made of the manifestos? I mean, we've had the Greens, we've had the Reform contract this week as well.
What no one's actually talking about is the fact that there's huge change coming in this country, and it doesn't matter who wins unless Reform somehow get a huge, become the next government. Every other party is committed to net zero and committed to doing it very quickly, and it's all going to happen in the next 5 years. The Tories have said they will decarbonise the entire electricity sector by 2035. By 2030, they're going to decarbonise 95% of the electricity system. What's Labour's policy? 100% by 2030. It's paper thin, the difference between the two parties on this. And that's going to mean a huge amount of change in the next 5 years. It's going to mean a lot more, both offshore and onshore wind, a lot of solar panels, a hell of a lot more infrastructure. So we're talking pylons everywhere, because we've got a lot of change coming. They want to get rid of all new petrol and diesel cars by 2030, 2035 for the Tories, 80% by 2030 for the Tories. So it's not that difference again. Heat pumps in all homes over the next couple of decades. These changes are coming, and they're coming into our homes in a way that they've never done before. You look at net zero. We're halfway to net zero, but that's been achieved by building wind farms out at sea and shutting coal-fired power stations. That doesn't make any difference to me. I've never seen a coal-fired power station, I don't think, except driving past it on the M1. We can have huge changes.
This is the one near Leicester.
Talking about that change, we've had a lot of questions about this. You've just answered quite a few of them, so well done. But we've got one here from Nilesh That, who says, in order to achieve net zero, just give a ballpark figure of what's the economic impact on an average family? You know, and given all that change is about to come, how much should we all be expecting to pay for it?
Well, no one's really told us. This is one of the things, you know, no one's really done assessments. Analysts have looked at it. It's kind of talking in the hundreds of billions in the next couple of decades.
Per household?
No, not per household.
Best start saving.
But
Inflation is under control now.
But no one's really told us. The green optimists will tell us it'll save us money, but essentially this money's got to come from somewhere. Labour's plan is for a lot of private investment to come to it. It doesn't necessarily have to come out of people's pockets, but it's got to come from somewhere. The Tories do it by putting it onto bills, onto gas bills, onto energy bills. Labour might move it more onto private sector, and potentially the fairest way would be onto income tax. But, you know, that's a big political no-no because it's raising taxes. It's the stealth taxes that will probably get you. It'll be on bills. But no one's been honest about this. This is not a new thing. But yeah, this change is coming because we're signed up to it. Unless someone's going to rewrite the law, these are legally binding targets.
Reform would, I think. Aisha, I know energy policy is quite big in Scotland. I know you've been there quite a lot. We've seen the SNP manifesto today. Just give us a quick idea of what the picture's like there. I mean, will the SNP hold on to many seats?
I think the SNP is actually going to lose quite a few seats. So remember, just for context, the Labour Party was very dominant in Westminster seats in Scotland up until the 2015 general election campaign. There had been the Scottish referendum in 2014. The Unionists won, but the Labour Party paid a very heavy price that night on 2015. They lost every single MP but one, and Labour's really struggled to kind of get back support, and the SNP has been very dominant in Scottish politics. But since Nicola Sturgeon resigned, the SNP has had its own problems. It's had police investigations, it's had a lot of infighting. Humza Yousaf has, of course, had to resign. They've got a new leadership team in there. And lots of people in Scotland are suddenly saying, well, hang on a minute, the SNP have been in charge for a long time, and we've got problems with our schools, hospitals, cost of living crisis. In the Highlands and Islands, ferries don't work properly. So there's a lot of things which have, and what was interesting for me being up there was that up until quite recently, when you were canvassing in Scotland, independence was the dominant issue for a lot of people. So when you knocked on someone's door, how they were going to vote was very much governed by independence. Now when you're speaking to people, they're saying, look, many people are still saying, look, at some point I would like independence, but it's not even the top 5 of my issues anymore. So for the first time, a lot of people who do want independence, they have voted SNP, they do want a change, and they're prepared to vote for the Labour Party. So I think you are going to see the Labour Party doing pretty well in these elections. However, there are Holyrood elections that are going to take place in May 2026. So from July the 5th, that campaign begins in Scotland. And John Swinney, who's the new leader of the SNP, Kate Forbes is the deputy leader, and they've got a Westminster leader called Stephen Flynn. They're quite popular and they're quite good performers. You can bet that the minute a Labour government, if they win, according to the polls, they will start saying that in that run up to 2026 in Holyrood, they'll be saying, right, how is Labour in Westminster delivered for you? So Labour's going to have to show pretty quickly that it can deliver for people in Scotland. Otherwise, you can almost see the kind of nationalist cause rise again, saying, look, you can't, even though there's a change of government in Westminster, nothing has changed for you. So Scotland is going to be really, really important. Very quickly on energy. Energy is really, really important in Scotland. You've got oil and gas, big oil and gas fields, lots of jobs in oil and gas, but also it's a real hub for renewables as well, a lot of this net zero. And I've been speaking to a lot of big energy companies in Scotland. They actually really like what Labour is proposing, partly because, as you say, there's a huge, I mean, the Labour manifesto is banking on a lot of collaboration with the private sector. And you've not heard that from a Labour Party for a long, long time. Rachel Reeves absolutely has charmed business. So you've got a lot of the big leaders in the energy companies saying, yeah, I like Rachel Reeves, I like what she's offering us. And this idea of this this great British energy company being headquartered in Scotland, they're thinking about jobs, they're thinking about skills academies, they're thinking about training, you know, as we wean ourselves off oil and gas, a whole new industry of green renewable jobs. So actually the energy package that Labour's putting forward is going down pretty well with business leaders.
Well, I'd love to understand more about the detail of that, you know, how they propose to, as it were, incentivise private companies to get involved, how they choose them, what incentives. I think I've just said that. But on the, you know, we do have to transition away from fossil fuels, not just because of climate change, but because fossil fuels are becoming less efficient thermodynamically. We're getting less energy from them. But this is a global challenge of huge geostrategic complexity, because the more solar panels we wish to build and the more wind turbines, the more critical metals and minerals we require. There is an order of magnitude more minerals and metals required to build out a renewable infrastructure when compared to fossil fuels. These exist across the subsurface of the Earth. Some of the most critical materials, like cobalt, it's dominated by the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the Wagner Group and others are seeking to get their access to these minerals. China dominates the processing of these minerals, almost 95%. America has sold its last cobalt mines in the Democratic Republic of Congo. We're seeing growing resource nationalism in Latin America. The West is way behind the curve on this. People talk about, you know, we're going to do it this way. The models that they're using to figure out what the price of cobalt and lithium will be in 5 years' time are completely derelict.
Yeah.
And I worry that in order to understand something as multidimensional as the energy transition, you need to have people with an understanding of thermodynamics, energy, politics, infrastructure, grid enhancement and enlargement. And at the moment we have these narrow teams of politicians saying things, and I see the paragraph in the manifesto. I don't want to sound pessimistic, it does nothing like sufficient justice to one of the biggest challenges our species has ever faced, which is transition from a high density fuel to a low density fuel.
I think you just wrote Sunday's column.
I write about energy too much. I think
But this is one of the dangers, the great strategic challenges that the globe is facing and everyone else sort of
We're
seems
all
to be
over the
focusing
place.
on. We're not even mentioning, you know, massive electoral moment. Who in this country even talks about that stuff?
There is also, look, I suppose this because I have slightly two hats on and I'm aware of that. Being a commentator is really easy on this, right? Because you can just do the big, oh, it's all terrible, it's a council of despair, it's all really, really difficult. If you're a politician, you've got to get across the line and win. And just look at the history of politicians. Take a step back. This country is essentially a centre-right country, historically. In the past 100 years, there have only ever been 6 Labour Prime Ministers, and of those, only 4 have been elected. Since 2010, there have been 5 Conservative Prime Ministers, by the way. So to Matthew's point that he made earlier, because Labour is so good at losing elections, and we got absolutely spanked in 2019, the Labour Party right now is doing the Ming Val strategy because they just want to get over the line. The strategists...
Do you think they'll have a strategy on this
Yeah,
stuff?
yeah,
after?
that's
'Cause
what
that's
worries me.
my theory is it's just not even on their agenda.
I think that I think that is doing them a disservice when you have got people like Sue Gray and people who have worked in government for years. And remember, they are speaking to like some of the biggest people, biggest brains, people from business. I think it is naive. I'm not saying they've got everything thought through, and let's be honest, until they get in and do the drains up, let's look at the situation. Look, there could be a prisons crisis within the first 100 days. There's loads of things. Councils could start going bankrupt. There's loads of things that could go wrong. But I think we are being, if I dare say, a bit lazy in just saying, yeah, they've done nothing. They're just sitting around scratching themselves, and when they get in, there's no plan.
It's just whether it'll be sort of in the top 10 things that they're worried
One thing I would say is that I don't get the sense from Keir Starmer that he thinks about these things when he gets up in the morning, in the sense that he's quite an internationalist. He's worked all over the world on legal cases. I don't think defence or foreign policy or these kind of big geostrategic issues are what really drives him. I think it's about getting a fair deal for working people in Britain, which is important and admirable. But I don't think it's at the centre of his worldview. And when I've asked him about foreign policy questions, yes, okay, we've got to get the Ming Vase over the line, but his answers are very Foreign Office boilerplate. It doesn't strike me that there's a lot of big thinking going on there, because I don't think it's his main priority. I think he looks at a country where things aren't working for ordinary people, and that's the priority. And when I asked him about how do you feel about putting boots on the ground in Ukraine, or how seriously have you thought about China and Taiwan? He's obviously thought about these things. He's a thoughtful person, and he's hoping to be Prime Minister. But I don't get the sense that that's where the heft of his energy and time goes.
I think also the Ming Vasery is also, they're making life difficult for themselves, because just to go back to energy briefly, they had a plan. They had a plan that was fully costed. They wrote it in 2021, and Ed Miliband was Energy Secretary under Gordon Brown in 2008. He's going to be Energy Secretary in 2 weeks' time. He's got a lot of experience. He'd written up this plan, and they allowed politics and quite a Route 1 attack line from the Tories to chuck it in the bin. And now they're going to have to do it with very little money.
So here's a counterfactual for you. Had they not sort of kicked that into the long grass or taken that figure off the headline, what do you think would have happened?
I think it would have been a massive stick that the Tories would have used, and quite an effective stick. And actually, I think the general feeling is that it was not a comfortable thing, and there's many people in the party who share your view, but most people thought it was probably a sensible thing to do.
But they had quite an easy route out of that, which was to say, all right, this costing was written in 2021, we'll ditch that, we'll let you know how much it's going to cost when we get into and have a look at the accounts. But instead they put a figure of 5 billion on it, which currently we're spending 8 billion. The amount that they want to do with a shrinking pot from 28 billion to 5 billion, it's going to be almost impossible, right? And no one really thinks they're going to achieve this 2030 target.
But again, going back to just certainly just talking to ordinary voters, if you think politicians aren't thinking deeply enough about boots in Ukraine and the cost of the energy thing, voters are not thinking about that either. Voters are talking, are just wanting.
But there was an interesting challenge you issued there, and I think a completely valid one for journalists, is that we criticise. It's easy to criticise, difficult to do. So let's take your hypothesis at face value, that Labour are not saying what they're really going to do, because they don't want to drop the Ming Vase, but once they get in, they have a plan. I think we agreed they had to be bold to shift us out of this stagnation that we have suffered from for a long time. That sits behind, by the way, the fact that they don't want to commit to 28 billion. It's because the fiscal position is not conducive to that. That's what it all comes back to in the end. So we need bold policies, I think, on a greater scale than Attlee or Thatcher. I think this is an absolutely, what's the terrible word that people use, an inflection point. But I do think we should talk about what Labour should do, rather than just say, why haven't they announced it? I'd like to see a land value tax. A land value tax is a tax on the undeveloped value of land. Land in this country is worth about £7 trillion. And it's gone up, and people have benefited from the rise in land values. And if you tax land, and I hate to lose any of our viewers here who own land, I own a bit of land, we'd be able to reduce direct taxation, which is distortionary, like income tax and corporation tax. You cannot take your land abroad if it is taxed. The land is common. It's something that is supported by the Institute for Economic Affairs, a very right-wing think tank, the Adam Smith Institute, but also on the left. This is the kind of policy that all economists, bar almost none, 95% think would seriously turbocharge growth. We don't talk about it at all, and it won't happen under Labour. What about that? What about changing the absurd human rights consensus that we have around the world today, where people have a right to go to any country if they're a refugee? China and Russia are weaponizing this in the Central African Republic, fomenting conflict in order to increase the flow of people, put pressure on Western societies, which is leading to a faster drumbeat of populists. Nuclear power stations. South Korea are building them, India are building them, China are building them. We're way behind. The reform of planning, they're tinkering on the edges. At the moment, leaner, hungrier nations are forging ahead. We're all over the place.
We've had a bunch of questions coming in.
Am I getting a bit overexcited here, by the way?
I mean,
That's your job.
I think we'd be really good on the doorstep. I think that would go down really well on the pledge card.
Sign for Wokingham. Come on.
Honestly, they're ready for you now. We've had a bunch of questions from David Walker, Stephen Skelly, a few people about Brexit, because that's one of the things that nobody is talking about in this election. There are no bold policies being put forward. Nobody really wants to address it at all. Josh, you've spent a lot of time with Keir Starmer.
We're going to keep going on about that now.
I know we are. But I mean, what do you think he's planning? Because we're not hearing very much about it.
You asked them about Brexit, Labour, and they will. We saw a bit from Rachel Reeves this week.
Yeah.
There was a sort of little crack in the
Tinkering
door was
with the
opened. Clearly, they want to do stuff on defence. I mean, there's a big meeting of the European political community in July in Blenheim Palace. That's Macron's brainchild. But at the heart of that is the idea that Europe needs to do more on defence, and Britain will obviously be at the core of that. So I think we can expect movement on that, on veterinary stuff, possibly on educational stuff. I think they are also aware that the moment they start saying things on Brexit, and we saw this in certain papers this week, they are going to get absolutely hammered for betraying the British people from day one, and it will be relentless. So I think they're willing to have that fight, but the question is when and on what terms. I mean, I've had people say on background to me that they see big Brexit change as a second term thing. So that if they can win re-election, that's when you can really change the dial on Brexit. But if they try and make big changes on Brexit in their first term, that could lose them an election, because it's just such a emotive issue for certain voters and for certain parts of the media. So that's Labour's position, but you're right that no one else.
It's odd, given that the polling, even from people who supported Brexit, actually does seem to be turning.
Yeah, but if you look back at Brexit in the Corbyn years, it split the coalition, it lost them the red wall, or contributed to that, and it was a nightmare. You couldn't, with Brexit at the fore, you couldn't build a Labour coalition, a big Labour coalition in this country. With Brexit out the picture, well, look where we are.
I can't quite believe we've got this far into a session without talking about what seems to be the only story, really, of this election that is surprising anyone, and that's reform. Matthew, you brought it up earlier. We've got a question here from Dennis Perkins saying, why are they so popular? Is it all about Nigel Farage?
No, I think it's, partly about him, but also because the public feel legitimately betrayed by successive parties who have said one thing on immigration and then done something completely different. That was true under Labour, and I say this as somebody who stood for Labour, but it's particularly true under the Conservatives. David Cameron in 2010, you can look at the manifesto, it says we will reduce immigration to the tens of thousands, and it was averaging, I think, 300,000 over the relevant period. People thought, it was said again in 2015 manifesto, the 2017 manifesto, the 2019 manifesto, they said we're going to reduce immigration. I think I'm right in saying people voted for Brexit to reduce it, and people were lied to by both parties at successive general elections, not on a trivial issue, not on something, circumstances changed, we had to do something. It's like, this is something of historic significance. Whether you agree or disagree that immigration is good for Britain, it is clearly wrong that politicians lie about an issue. If you look at the last 1,000 years of British history, the amount of net migration has taken off. It is historically unprecedented. And I think that Farage is weaponized. It's no good saying Farage is a terror. I'm not going to vote for Farage. I don't like the far right. But he's a symptom, not a cause in this context. And I think it infuriates me that people in the central positions of politics, I think this left-right distinction doesn't make any sense anymore, by the way. I think it is a completely misleading. The multidimensionality of politics, trying to fit it on a two-dimensional spectrum is mad. However, I'm going to use the word centrist. The centrists who do not acknowledge culpability for the destruction of trust, which is at an unprecedented low, is completely amazing to me. And I think that Farage is weaponising this, and it's completely understandable that he's doing, and I kind of understand voters who are angry enough to vote for it. I wouldn't do it, but I get where they're coming from.
Isn't part of the truth that this is a global megatrend, and there's actually possibly a limit to how much we can actually do about immigration without changing our laws and changing our values? You know, I mean, you think actually stopping the boats. I mean, Rwanda was an example of this. If you actually implemented the full Rwanda, it might have some impact, I don't know, but it might well do. But fundamentally, our laws and our values sort of don't allow us to go there. We're not willing to take those kind of inhumane, what many people see as cruel decisions to get us there, and illegal in some cases. So the truth is, when you think about what climate change, war, political instability, technology is doing to immigration around the world, and bringing people to not just Britain but all of Europe, it's a wave of humanity coming from all over the planet. What I really don't think politicians are being honest about is, I don't know if we are able to stop it, at least not without changing who we are and making decisions, a bit like Trump tried with family separation, which was a very cruel policy, but as were other of his immigration policy, but it did bring down immigration. It did work to some extent.
I feel I've spoke too much on this, but you're talking about illegal immigration. When you talk about Rwanda, these are refugees who are coming rather than the immigration that we are welcoming and accepting through our laws. But I don't think it's a particularly humane policy. People are dying as they come over. And as I say, the crucial point about all this, which is often missed, is, as I said a bit earlier, Russia is explicitly weaponizing this issue, because when there is instability in Africa, these refugees don't go to China, and they don't go to Russia, and they don't go to, well, they have been going a little bit to Iran or North Korea, they come to the West. So it increases the pipeline.
To move on, but just very quick counter to that, though, is that both Russia and China, at the moment, their biggest economic threat is actually population decline. And they're both too xenophobic to really accept people coming in. Is it really about the way we talk about immigration? You know, when we create the fear rather than understanding that actually it can be an advantage in many cases.
I think there's a couple of things. First of all, there's no doubt that successive governments, and to Matthew's point, I think I agree with quite a lot of that. When you say you're going to cut the numbers and then they go up, and that's legal migration as well as illegal migration, something has gone very wrong. And also, just speaking today, in fact, I had a very long conversation about immigration this morning, speaking to some real experts. Somebody was heavily involved in the Migration Advisory Committee, was actually seen as quite a good thing, as a sort of an arm's length, set of experts. And they will say that, yes, the false targets are a really damaging, stupid thing to do, but also they will say to you that we have had successive governments and successive Home Secretaries, particularly in the last 14 years, that have not put the graft in to do this. We've also had a lot of cuts to the border forces and things like that. So there's a lack of trust. There has also been a massive erosion of actual competence on this issue, so particularly for illegal. Then you have the backlog in the asylum system, and all. So it's all come together in a perfect storm. Then you have, to your structural point, massively low investment in skills. Why are we not skilling up people in this country to do some of these jobs? So you've got lots of things interconnecting. But part of the problem is the way we have spoken about immigration. It's so binary. Either you have to have open borders, or you're an absolute Nazi fascist on the other. There's no kind of sensible conversation in between. We will always need a certain amount of immigration. Even Reform that put forward just in the last few weeks a big idea to tax, for employers to be taxed more if they bring overseas workers in. They've exempted workers for health and social care. So even Nigel Farage understands that our whole health and social care sector would fall over if it wasn't for immigrants. So I think there has got to be, I mean, it sounds really boring, but like a sensible, honest conversation with the public about the benefits of migration, but the limits, particularly when you look at infrastructure and the fact that public services and public money have to follow flows of people as well. It has to be well managed. So there's a really big need to kind of reset the conversation on this.
So we need a more sensible conversation around immigration. In the meantime, Reform does seem to be doing very well. There is certainly a very good chance that Nigel Farage will win his seat in Clacton and possibly one or two others. What does this mean for the Tory party after the election? Is this sort of a lurch further to the right? What do we think will happen? Ben?
Well, if you look at, there's some interesting analysis been done on who will be left, and you you look at the numbers of the 60 or 70. If you're looking at those kind of polling numbers, and actually, if you look at who's left, and it's actually pretty similar political spread, but the leader kind of figures amongst that are very much the right of the party. People like Braverman, Kemi Badenoch, and you just
Nigel Farage.
well, but you've got to think about where the splits are going to appear between what's been pretty much a political consensus of the last 20 years. I mean, you're talking about there being no difference between left and right anymore. I kind of agree with that, really. On key issues, there hasn't been. You know, whether it's NHS, whether it's climate change, whether it's immigration, foreign policy, there's not much difference between the parties. But that could all change after this election if a rump of the Tory party is led by the right.
Aisha, I know you've come across Reform
so
quite a lot.
I think it's going to be absolutely fascinating. My prediction is that Nigel Farage is going to win big in Clacton. I think they may pick up a few other seats, possibly Ashfield, Lee Anderson in Ashfield. But if you look back to Conservative Party conference last autumn, it was pretty moribund. It was pretty dead. HS2 was cancelled. It was all a shambles. Who electrified Tory Party conference? It wasn't on the main stage. Who was the darling of Tory Party conference where the buzz was, the pulse was quickened? It was the sight of Suella Braverman, Priti Patel and Nigel Farage living their best life, Jacob Rees-Mogg. That is the future of the Conservative Party. My prediction is Nigel Farage comes in, wins Clacton. I think you will have a Suella Braverman, Priti Patel who wins, because I think the activist base, even though the remaining MPs might be quite centrist, the activist base is much closer to Nigel Farage. I think the next leader of the Conservative Party will be chosen by GB News viewers, GB News is going to be really important to the future of the Conservative Party. I think Nigel Farage will be let into the Conservative Party. I think he's like political Japanese knotweed. I think when he gets a toehold, he can have a very powerful effect. I think you're going to see the Conservative Party go much more to the right, and Nigel Farage is going to be a really important player. And I spoke to somebody from Reform, one of the deputy leaders, and he said to me, our absolute plan, it's a 5-6 year project, and it is to get into the Conservative Party. That is going to be our political vehicle.
Wow, so that's the plan. And that's what they see happening. It's interesting though, because obviously at the moment GB News has a relatively small audience. Do you think right-wing politics will become just more mainstream, or are they just going to end up trying to appeal to a smaller and smaller crowd?
I think they will do that for a while. I think when parties lose badly, and this happened to the Labour Party over successive losses, you go into your comfort zone. Labour went to the left. I think the Conservatives will go to the right for a while, where the reality is parties win when they move back to the centre.
That's what I think. That's wrong. I just don't think there is an obvious political centre. I mean, if I think of my own views, I think there needs to be more redistribution of income and wealth, more redistribution of opportunity. I think we're too unequal as a society. That would be traditionally considered left. I disagree with Josh on asylum. I think the entire structure of our laws and conventions are not working, either for refugees or for the Western world, and this is benefiting totalitarian states that want to destroy the liberal Western order. I have a particular view on immigration, on the NHS. I'm perfectly happy to see a social insurance system. That might be considered. The idea that there is some centre, in this world that we're living in today, of massive change, the energy transition the most important of them, I just don't think you can locate a political centre that has any meaning or coherence. What would define the political centre? What are the array of politics? I listened to it's a podcast I listened to. All the best ones, by the way, are organised, the story and so on. But I listened to another political podcast where they're talking about centre-left, centre-right, and they were talking about parties that had absolutely nothing in common with each other. It is such a it seems to me, I don't know if you feel this way, but it seems to me such a misleading way to think about politics today, when there are so many of these different aspects that you can, I think, quite coherently have a set of positions that don't fit into this.
Is it a case of people changing their allegiances, but parties not necessarily reflecting that at the moment, because they're all trying to sort of, everyone's carrying a Ming bars, trying to sort of appeal to everyone at the same time, and therefore not really differentiate themselves in the way that you're talking about. You don't see a left-wing party suddenly saying immigration is a disaster and we must cancel asylum laws.
Is it conceivable we'll have a left-wing party? I think yes, it is. I mean, Attlee and Bevin were seriously keen on borders that were enforceable. It seems to me not contradictory at all. We've drifted into this
idea. We've got a question here which actually it seems quite pertinent. Bryn Williams says, because of the first past the post electoral system, both Labour and Conservative parties attempt to accommodate unsuccessfully a broad church of different views. The devolved parliaments are electing using proportional representation. Should the UK follow suit?
I don't think there's a lot of appetite for that. We tried that in 2011 wasn't the referendum? The AV referendum. I mean, it staked the whole thing on.
How much did the Lib Dems get from that?
How many people voted?
What was the turnout? I mean, at a time when there's so many political kind of, priorities at the moment.
But would you move closer towards Matthew's system of sort of parties actually representing very different views if you allowed for proportional representation?
I think Matthew's right, because I think I started my career on the Sheffield Star, and there was a guy who was a Lib Dem councillor who in Stockbridge, and he was on the chair of the licensing board, very powerful man in Sheffield. He defected to UKIP. I think you're right. People don't have these narrowly defined views. If you can go from the Liberal Democrats to UKIP, in Suffolk, which is all blue at the moment, people are voting Green. They're Tory Green marginals in Suffolk.
But those allegiances have diminished over time. I think when we were kids, it was much clearer. People tended to have party allegiances that were handed down from their parents. I mean, that has all attenuated over time, and if you look at the party membership numbers, Tory party used to have hundreds and hundreds of thousands, millions of members. Now you could get them all in this office. I think it really has shifted in terms of the way people connect to the parties.
I think that's right, but I also think that voters have really changed. The sort of days where you can chap on someone's door and they'd be like, "Yeah, I'm a Labour man because my granddad was a Labour man," and his
less
those days are
tribal.
gone. I would say now voters are really savvy. They're really transactional. They're like on the things they care about. They're like, "What are you doing for me?" They're very promiscuous. They will jump about. They'll vote tactically.
It's actually better for democracy.
It is, and they're also very impatient, and rightly so. Ungrateful. They're not like, and this is a point. In terms of Labour, Labour must not think, "Oh, there's going to be some grateful public there." Look at Biden. Everybody's like, "Oh yeah, Biden's in. He's going to be there for ages." He might be a one-term president. Voters are very ruthless now. If they feel, and we're much more febrile times. It used to be the fact that if you could get into power, you'd have minimum 2 terms. We saw that with Boris Johnson on the night of 2019 when Boris Johnson won that amazing landslide. I thought, gosh, the Tories are definitely going to be in for 2 terms, maybe even 3. And politics can change really quickly because the voters. And the tactical voting, I think, is a really interesting development in our democracy. And it is a good thing. I think it is a good thing. It keeps politicians on their toes as they should be kept.
We are running out of time, but just very quickly, any of you want to try and address it? It's a massive question, so good luck. Brian Billingham says, what can be done to mend our broken politics, particularly given the increasing tendency for politicians to lie and intentionally misinform the electorate? Now, I know cynically all say that's always happened, but it does feel like standards have really deteriorated over the last few years. How do you begin to fix that?
I've got one quick answer to that. Maybe others will have other answers, but I think the decline of local news in this country is a real issue, and I think power being more dispersed and held accountable on the local level would be much better, because at that national level we have this quite frenetic, over-caffeinated national media, 24-hour rolling news, politicians constantly scrambling. Basically, government by press announcement is what we've had for too long, and I think doing much more of that scrutiny at a local level with empowered local media would help a little bit, would be my view.
Well done for getting us an answer.
That's not the entire answer, but
it's one. It's a start. We are almost out of time, but I did just want to say to Carl Davies, who's written in saying, Matthew for PM. Such a brilliant thinker and speaker. The people of Wokingham don't know what they've missed.
they missed out there.
John Redwood's standing down. You could have a chance now.
The constituency boundaries have changed. I think it's winnable.
Did you get selected and then lose in the general?
Do you mean I get selected as a Labour candidate?
Yeah.
Yes, I did.
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't difficult. I shouldn't say that, because there was another candidate, but there was only two of us at the hustings.
And how did you do on the doorstep?
I hot-footed it down. I was playing table tennis in the Olympics that year. And I remember going down in my tracksuit and saying,
It's just
"Come
your
on."
average Sunday Times columnist, mate.
But thank you. Who was it? Who
In the
came up with this
Olympics
comment?
and standing
It was Ian.
Carl
the reader.
Davies.
Carl, thank
Davies.
you. Thank you.
Thank you to everyone who's watched. We're really grateful. We are completely out of time, but thank you for joining us. There will be another session, this time next Wednesday. Do log on. And also, it's one more day. If you're a Times Plus subscriber, you've got one more day to try and register to come here live for the big one on July the 2nd. Please do have a look. You can find that at Times Plus, mytimesplus.co.uk/events. Thanks again for joining us, and thank you to the panel.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for being here. Wokingham. It's not too late.